talking about bears, I'd like to talk a little bit about their history, their biology, distribution in the state, and then talk about some of the research we've done, which includes a population estimate, and we're now looking at survival and recruitment of females so that we can forecast what the growth of the population will do over time. So black bears are like a lot of our large animals in the state. They were abundant until European settlement, at which time the Europeans basically changed the landscape through intensive logging, through unregulated hunting, and just the whole demographic was different. We had people in the Ozarks trying to make a living on every 40 acres. We had free-range livestock, and that combination just didn't work for bears. It didn't work for a lot of our large game species like deer, elk, even turkeys were affected by that. Bears sort of took the place of pork for the early settlers. They have a fat on them that can be used to waterproof items. You can render the fat and make candles out of it, and they're good to eat, especially when folks didn't have the luxuries that we have today. Now, it seemed like bears went away for a while, and what we think happened was they were largely extirpated, and we may have had just a few bears wandering around the state until sometime in the 1960s when Arkansas began a capture and release or a reintroduction program for the state. And this was kind of interesting because what happened was the administrators in Arkansas Game and Fish were going on a junket, basically. They would go up to Minnesota or they'd go up to Manitoba, they'd go fishing. And on the way back, they'd grab a few bears from the local dump or panhandlers that the DNR caught up there. They bring them back down to Arkansas and let them go. It wasn't a well thought out strategy, and it wasn't probably wasn't conducted in a way that it would be today. Matter of fact, for the first 6 years, they only released male bears. So I'm pretty sure that wasn't responsible for our resurgence of bears in Missouri. However, towards the end, they began to catch some female bears, and even I think the last year or two, they might have put ear tags on them. Yet, the reports were such that it looked like this reintroduction effort didn't work. Later, bears started to show up in places where they hadn't been for a while, and now as we look back at this, it appears that this reintroduction effort worked great, and Arkansas's attempt actually brought bears back to not only Arkansas but Oklahoma and Missouri. So it's now considered one of the most successful reintroduction programs for a large carnivore. It's interesting, in this photo here we have a picture of a cinnamon or a brown bear. That typically we don't see that color phase this far east, but when they reintroduced these animals, actually the ones they brought had a real influence on what was cultivated over time, and so we now have about a third of our bears, give or take, that have some color phase different than a pure black bear. So today, or recently at least, we had kept track of bear range in the state through Sightings. We have a website in which people can report sightings or call, and we even have places at a lot of our nature centers where folks can fill out a form and send that in to us. We use this as a means to sort of keep track of the range of bears in the state. And as it started off in 1987, not a whole lot of sightings, but by the time we get to 2014, we can see that bears have been reported in about in more counties than they haven't. And some of these situations in which bears are getting way up into North Missouri, you may look at that and say, well, that person probably saw a big black lab, or they had been drinking, or what, I don't know what. But actually, it's interesting that we had one bear that went all the way up to Kansas, all the way up to Iowa, along the border of Kansas and Missouri. And we've had a few other bears do these big exploratory jaunts, and then they come back to the Ozarks where the population is. So when someone calls or reports a bear in an unusual spot, I'd certainly never say never. It's possible. And if we look at the overlay of sightings versus habitat, green represents forest, we can see that bears have, seems like at least the males have found the best forested habitat in the state. Bears are considered a carnivore, but they're actually closer to an omnivore if you look at the true diet. Carnivore is based on their tooth formula, dental formula, and omnivores more closely resembles what they eat. So bears are probably like a large raccoon more so than they are a true carnivore like a coyote. They eat whatever available. And it's really interesting when we look at these bear movements, how they are probably using the landscape depends on what's available for them to eat. In Missouri, certainly acorns are probably the most important food source for them in the fall and the winter, but they will eat a variety of other foods. Bears have a slow reproductive rate. They're not ever going to become overabundant like some species, deer, rabbits, some of these species that have a high reproductive rate can become very abundant. Bears don't breed until they're at least 3 and sometimes not until they're 7. So if you can imagine a female not breeding until she's 7 years old, you're not going to be bringing a lot of cubs into the population each year. The other thing is that bears spend quite a bit of time with their offspring. So a female has cubs, those cubs are born in her den, then they stay with her the entire summer and fall, and I'm sure she shows him, you know, where you can find acorns in October, where you can find common black beetles in August, where you can find blackberries in July. And then they den together as a family unit. The next spring, when they erupt, when they leave their dens, the males will take off and they're gonna go live off on their own somewhere. Female black bears will set up a home range right next to their mother or even within the mother's range. So when you see a population of black bears, the females are all related. But the males, they're jumping back and forth between populations, and that's why we don't have inbreeding problems with bears. Cub litter sizes in Missouri, we're seeing about 2 to 3 cubs per adult female bear. And then the survival of those cubs is what we're measuring right now, so we may not have that many cubs actually making it to adulthood. As I mentioned, the cubs stay with the female and will run with her to learn the landscape, learn the behaviors, and then they'll be off on their own. A few years back, we decided we have these bears and we better decide what we're going to do with them. So we got together with a bunch of other agencies, including Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, Army Corps of Engineers, National Park Service, other departments within our agency to draft a black bear management plan. This plan's on the internet if you want to read about it, but basically what it does is it designs or outlines what we'd like to do with our bear population over the next 5 or 10 years. It's kind of our roadmap. High on our list of goals is just to learn about bears. We really don't know where bears are, or we didn't when we started at least, where bears are in the landscape. How many do we have? What's the reproduction rate? Is the population growing? Is it declining? We're trying to learn that sort of thing right now. So our project then was first to figure out how many bears we have, and then when we figured out how many we have, our next step may be to have a regulated hunting season. It may be to let the population grow. We had some decisions based on what we found out with our population estimate. If we look at this process here, we can see that we decided that if we had greater than 500 bears, it would probably be a good time to start a harvest season. We see some conflicts between male bears and humans, and a hunting season would give folks a chance that have trouble to take care of these problems and still use the animal. If we ended up with less than 500 animals, we didn't think it was time to start hunting bears, but rather we wanted to go back, learn more about the population, and see how that population is growing. If we get to the point where we have 500, then we'll go back and start talking about hunting season. So we started a research project first to see a little bit about where bears are moving, where are they on the landscape, and then to come up with an effort to measure their population. And measuring their population is not as easy as it is to say, for sure, because you start thinking about it. I'm driving around the Ozarks, how do we count how many bears we have? They all look the same, they occur at low densities, they're secretive, they don't come when you call them. You can take a picture with a trail camera, but you don't know if that's the same one you just took a picture of yesterday, and so there are certainly some caveats into doing that. We put GPS collars on these animals so that we could at least figure out where some of these animals were living, so we could start our population estimate efforts in areas where we knew we had bears. And here's what we learned. These home ranges basically are female bears, and it looks like we had about 4 different populations of females on the landscape. These collars are equipped with GPS transmitters, and so every time the GPS talks to a satellite, it will send us a location. Each location is represented by a dot, and so we can see this is actually where these bears were on the landscape. And then if we connect the dots from a season, we can see where they spent most of their time. As I said, these are all females, and so we have quite a bit of overlap in home ranges, and that's because these are all related females. So there's probably in each of these populations, there's probably 1 or 2 females that started this thing. She was the spark of the population. Over time, she had cubs. Those cubs set up their own range, their own home range, and so we have these colonies or societies of female bears on the landscape. The next thing that we wanted to do is figure out how many bears we have altogether. We know we have some bears captured, but certainly not all of them. And fortunately, science has progressed quite a bit to the point where now we can identify a bear if we can get 7 hairs from that animal. If we can take the follicles from those 7 hairs and do a DNA analysis, we can identify the sex of that species, and we can also identify the individual. If I took everybody in this room and I pulled some hair out of your head and we did DNA analysis, I could identify how many males we had, how many females, and I could say, you know, you are A7309-6, and each person would be identified that genotype. We did the same thing with bears. We used something called a hair snare, where we would string barbed wire around 4 or 5 trees in the woods, put something in the middle of that barbed wire that a bear wants to eat or smell. When the bear comes through, he goes over or under that barbed wire, it leaves some hair. We come back at a 7-day interval and we check every single one of these barbs and collect all the hairs that have been on there. Each barb represents a different potential capture, so we would take an envelope and put the hairs from each barb into this envelope, and then take a torch and burn the fence around it so that we don't get any duplication errors. What we found was when you put, in this case we had anise oil and fish oil in the woods, everything's interested in it. We had cameras on our hair snares because we wanted to learn how bears were working these snares. Do we need to change the wire height? Do we need to put 2 wires to catch bears? We didn't want bears coming that we didn't know were there or were missing their hair. So we had a lot of animals show up. We had raccoons, bobcats, a deer, believe it or not, coyotes, which we expected to see, feral hogs, gray foxes. He's right in there. He probably left us a sample. Some mean dude in the Ozarks, I don't know what he was doing out there, but it probably wasn't good. Dogs, free-running dogs are pretty abundant, and skunks. Did not see any spotted skunks, but we saw a lot of other animals interested in our hair snares. And here is, if I can get this to work. This is how they work a hair snare. So a female bear comes by, she goes underneath that snare, underneath that barbed wire, and we have her. And the next bear that comes by, if it goes right next to her, we'll be able to identify it as another individual. And I think once one bear visits, these things become more attractive because it kind of becomes a social spot. And sometimes you'll see bears rubbing on trees, and they're actually scent marking this as well. So it does give us a chance to take a look at what's out there and without handling these animals. So these things are operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This represents what we came up with later for grids, and if you remember those 4 populations, we've overlaid these hair snare grids on those populations. Each of these are 81 square miles, and we had a one hair snare on each corner of a section. That was a density that seemed to work when you put the math to it, when you put the statistics to it. We do a mark recapture analysis, we can come up with a population estimate if we have this dense of a catch effort. And to summarize, the first year we put out 382 hair snares, the second 403 hair snares. Altogether, we actually genotyped 141 individual animals. So we know we had at least 141 bears visit our sites. This doesn't include cubs. And we do know that we missed some bears, and what was happening was later in the summer, when the bears had shed all their winter hair, they'd come to these snares and they wouldn't leave anything. They had nothing to give. Their hair was tight and thin, and so we were having visits, but we weren't counting those animals. So we learned that we needed to do this a little bit earlier, and so our second year we used those earlier efforts, and we're able to come up with a population estimate overall of 279 bears in 2012. And we learned home ranges were large for bears in Missouri compared to what we've seen in other states. Male ranges of around 127 square miles, females around 40 square miles. So our bears are using a lot of landscape, and I think part of this is just because we have such a low density. If we were to look at this male bear here, he's covering 127 square miles of real estate, but he's really not using that way, but he covered a lot of ground in order to find these females in June. So when the bears occur at low densities, they have to do a lot of moving to interact socially. And I think that's what was going on here in Missouri. If we were to define our current bear range, this is what I would say is our population of breeding bears. We have young male bears that show up in a lot of different spots, a lot of different counties, but they're not staying there. They're out walking around, they're looking for a place to live, but they're not going to settle down until they can find female bears. This area down here in south central Missouri is an area of what, and we have both males and females, and we have reproduction. Another thing we looked at when we were doing our research was the age structure. Age structure of bears gives us a picture of the big picture of how this population is doing over time, and we're able to pull this premolar, which is about half the size of the nail on your pinky, and then we can stain that tooth and section it real thin, count the growth rings like growth rings on a tree under a microscope. This one here represents a 4-year-old animal. Probably as importantly for females, we can, in some cases at least, determine the age at which this female had her first litter of cubs. So she lays down a distinct annulation when she undergoes the stress of having cubs. We're trying to determine at what age do females have their first litter. So from this tooth, we can learn that with some of our bears, which is very helpful. Our population age structure, it looks good. We have a preponderance of young animals, with older animals doing the breeding and recruiting young animals into our population. So if we were to look at a population of another species that's long lived like this, you're going to see more young animals, fewer old animals as we go older. Bear captures represents kind of where bears are in the landscape, but it also represents our effort to catch them. And Seymour and Seymour area, Douglas County, Webster County are some of our areas where we have a lot of bears, relatively. This is kind of interesting. This is one of our bears that did a long-range dispersal, captured way down in southern Missouri, south of Highway 60, and it decided it was time to leave, and he went north, went all the way up to Interstate 44, spent 2 days trying to cross the interstate, and then chickened out, came back down south, and said, well, I'm going to try it again. Came back up and actually crossed the interstate up there in June. And this animal was really on the move. I remember I was actually coaching baseball and looking on my phone to see where is this thing now, because it was moving so much, and I was afraid it was going to get hit on Interstate 44. It went all the way up almost to Jefferson City, turned around, came back. It took it 2 days to cross there by Rolla, and then it came on back down parallel Highway 63 until it went down here in southern Missouri. But I think these movements reflect a little bit about how bears move on the landscape. One, if you just kind of stare at that and let your eyes wander, you can see the corridors that this bear used. Interstate 44 obviously was some sort of an impediment, the fact that it took it 2 days to cross it. And it didn't seem like it wanted to cross Highway 63 either, coming south. When you really expand that, you can see where it looks like the bear tested the highway, tested it, kept on moving south. So these roads are somewhat of an impediment. It's something we should probably keep in mind when we're managing for bears. Probably what I considered the funnest part of this research was looking at the bear dens. And each winter we will visit the dens so that we can see what kind of reproductive rates we're seeing. And we want to know what they use. If we see bears like a certain kind of a den, perhaps we can manage in favor of those structures. This was a male bear, an old male bear, and he denned up in early November. I think this was like the opening day of firearms deer season. And he's not supposed to den that early. Male bears aren't supposed to den until December. And I thought for sure he had been shot by a hunter, but as it turned out, I called up the agent. He went to check on the bear and he was still there. Here he is. You can barely see his ear tag. He's in a blowdown. I think we had a lot of acorns that year, and that bear got so fat that it wasn't worth his time to eat anymore, and he just went down, took his nap early. Typical female here, she denned in a bowl of a tree. Here she is actually laying on her collar. We got lucky here because she took her collar off in the den, but we were still able to find her, tranquilize her, and put that collar back on her. She had cubs. I had an intern student with me. She was actually measuring the dens. She said it was cozy and she wanted to take a nap in that den. Typical male den here in a slash pile. We have quite a bit of logging in the Ozarks, especially in southeast, south central Missouri, and we see a lot of bears that den in these slash piles. This one, I'm not sure what this female bear was thinking. I know that throughout the summer and fall they look at different den sites, and she just decided, I'm going to den against this tree. She's not here right now. She left before we got there, but this wouldn't be my choice of a great den site. When it rains, she gets wet. When she has cubs, predators are going to be around. The chance of her raising a litter of cubs certainly is not as good as if she had a more secure site. But I don't know if this one just decided I'm tired, or she liked the openness. I'm not sure. A much better den in my view. Here's a female with 3 yearlings. That's what it looks like when we open it up. You could fit a a VW Volkswagen down there, and 55 degrees, relatively constant temperature, and this den actually has been used twice, not by her, but another bear used it as well. So I suspect that second bear that used it was a cub that she probably raised here. It came back when it was on its own. It's like, oh, I remember this den, I'm going to use it. We see rock crevices being used a lot by bears, especially in southwest Missouri. These rocks are often on south slopes, and I think they pick up some solar gain from the sun. And it's a pretty good place to stay when the rocks get warm. Big male bear here. When we summarized bear den information, we saw that females tended to den up first, males tended to den up last. Most of our females are going to dens by November, and most of our males weren't in their dens until sometime in early December. So there's a period in there when we could actually, if we wanted to have a selective harvest, we could harvest some male bears while the females are in their dens, take care of some of these problem animals, but continue to grow the population. When we summarize the annual bear cycle in Missouri, we're here right now. Bears are emerging. They emerged a little bit late this year, but I'm confident most bears are out of their dens. Food becomes important when they leave their dens, but there's not a lot for them to eat. So this is a time when folks that camp or live in bear country really need to be careful with their campsites or their backyards. You don't want to leave a bunch of food open to bears. And I actually recommend that folks take down their bird feeders at this time of the year too, because birds don't need to be fed in the summertime. There's plenty to eat, but these bird feeders are a great attraction to bears. And if we can take them down, put them back up in the fall, we're going to alleviate a lot of bear problems. Certainly in Missouri, we have a high population of people and a growing population of bears, and so we need to increase our awareness. And there's a saying out there among biologists that a fed bear is a dead bear. And what we'd really need to do is convince the public to keep bears wild by not feeding. Don't recreationally feed bears. Don't throw them a hot dog because you want to take a picture of them. It only takes one event and a bear can learn that, oh, that human threw me a hot dog. The next human I go up to may throw me a hot dog, but that human may not see it the same way. And usually what happens is these bears become problems and we have to euthanize them. So I really want to impress to the public that we need to keep bears wild, so don't feed them. Here is some interesting video I just threw in. I thought it would be cool if we could see what does a bear do after we get done tranquilizing him. So we put a GoPro on his camera, and tranquilizer has the same effect, I think, as alcohol. When you come out of it, you're thirsty. So he spent about 20 minutes drinking water that day after we released him. But it was really cool to see the perspective of how the bear sees it. And this is just a short portion of it, but he spent a lot of time, it was hot, he was down in the creek eating vegetation and drinking water. Female bear at a den site. We put cameras up after we leave den sites just to make sure that she stays there. What happens to those cubs? Can we identify if a predator came in? Just trying to learn. This was a female bear that had 2 cubs, and it was getting late in the year. It was getting time for when they might leave. She stayed here another week before she left, but it was just kind of cool to see some of the interactions between her and her offspring. She was a big bear, probably 230 pounds, which is a big female. this is backwards, so it's hard to. And this was just a release of one of what I consider one of our coolest bears, a big male bear. I think he's 18 years old. And we had caught him a few times, and so there was no need to work him up. We just let him go. But to be able to see that big guy, that was pretty cool. These traps that we use are cub friendly. That door actually doesn't go this slow when it's closed, but it closes pretty slow. A lot of our other traps had a guillotine door, and we were always concerned that a cub might be in there and we would injure it. So we've gone to these more bear friendly traps.